And let me share the screen. Okay. Okay. So I think we're up to Sif Bays, are we not? I think that's what we were about to start. Yeah. Yeah. So if we finish Imrei Yaakov, let's start Sif Bays. We're on page Kuf Pei, and the Rab Shulchan Aruch states as follows: if you strike your fellow with a soft blow, where the amount of damage does not amount to a significant amount of damages. We're talking about the laws of damages. If you hurt someone, if you injure them, what the liability is. So if the amount of damage is minimal, it's what's called less than a shava pruta. A pruta is like 2 cents. We saw this brought down by the Imrei Yaakov previously. Since there's no monetary restitution due, a person is liable for lashes. Torah says that you're not allowed to strike someone. If you go ahead and do that, it's like eating a cheeseburger. You get malchus for it. You get lashes for it. And this halacha that prohibits striking another person is true even if he started the fight, which is, hey, he started it. Or if he insults you, right? Va'afilu, or he insults a relative of yours. Va'afilu hikahu. And even if he takes the first punch, you're still not allowed to punch him back. But the proviso is v'hu shepasak lahakoso. That's provided that it's a singular punch, right? It's a singular slap or whatever it is, right? And, there's an instinct to retaliate, right? Just like in the movies, okay? But the halacha is that if someone strikes you, you have to step back. And you cannot give him a swing back, even if you're bigger and stronger, okay? But v'hu shepasak lahakoto. But that's provided that he just takes one slap or one punch, and that's it. But aval im lo pasak. But if he's trying to beat you up, then you're obviously entitled to defend yourself. Rashai lahakoto to kedei lahatzil atzmo. You're allowed to strike him back in order to protect yourself. Im efshar lo lahatzil atzmo binyan acher, provided that you cannot save yourself some other way. In other words, if you can extricate yourself from a fight, you're obligated to do so according to halacha without striking back. If you perceive that the only way that you're going to be able to stop this opponent is by just showing him your strength and giving him a good zetz, so then you are permitted to do so to protect yourself. And if you can protect yourself with a small punch instead of a big punch, lo yakehu harbe, then you're not allowed to beat him to a pulp. You just have to do what is minimally required in order to put an end to this physical altercation. V'chein haroeh, let's see here. V'chein haroeh echad miYisrael makeh chavero. And similarly, if you see a fellow Jew getting into a fight, if you see, you're just an observer, and you see one Jew striking somebody else, ve'eno yachol lahatzilo miyado im lo sheyakeh hamakeh, and the only way to save the person is by striking the bully, mitzvah lahakoto kedei lahafrisho mi'iser, then you're allowed to strike the bully in order to stop him from doing that which is forbidden. But if you can save the victim, the person who's being beaten up, without striking the aggressor, then asur afilu l'dochvo, then you're not even allowed to push the aggressor. Im efsher l'shomto benachat, as long as you can extricate the victim without violence. V'chein haroa b'chavero she'osa eze davar avera acheret. And another point he says, anytime you see your friend doing any kind of sinful act, v'hu tachat yado u'reshuto lahakoto. Here's where it starts to get very shocking and surprising. Okay, if you see another Jew doing a sin, and you have the ability to stop him by applying physical force, rashai lahakoto kidei lahafrisho me'isr. You're allowed to use physical force in order to stop someone from doing a crime. You're allowed to stop someone using physical force to stop them from doing a crime. Ve'ein sarach lahavio lebeitin, and you're not required. So you see someone, he's about to commit robbery. You see someone, he's about to commit adultery. You see someone, he's about to eat a cheeseburger. All of these seem to be on the same level. You're allowed to actually use physical force to say, I'm not going to let you do this. But this is wrong. You have to stop. So this is the shocking part of it. And then we have to unpack it, right? Of course. The ein sarach lahavio lebeitin. You don't have to first assemble a rabbinic court in order to bring him to justice, because you have the opportunity to stop him right there. Aval im kvar asa ha'isser, ena rashai lahakoto el yavi'enu lebeitin via anshuhu. But that's only before the fact. But if it's already after the fact, he's already eaten the cheeseburger, then you're not allowed to do anything to him, right? But what you can do is you can bring him to your local tribunal and say, I accuse this man of having committed an Aveira, and I want him to be disciplined. Now, remember, the Rav Shulchan Aruch is writing this halacha in the medieval world when Jews lived in Shtetelach, and there was localized religious controls. In other words, most people in the small communities were observant. There were standards of observance within the community. And if a person were to violate those norms of religious observance, then there were means and methods that you could use to sort of bring this guy in line or ostracize him from the community. But this last part of the halacha is not very practical anymore, right? It doesn't work. So we're going to have to see this in the Imrei Yaakov in the commentary to see how this is applied in the modern world. What is my level of responsibility to stop or to prevent another Jew from doing an Aveira? Okay, so that's the whole halacha. Now we go to the commentaries. Now we have to unpack this whole thing that we've seen in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. So the first part is that you're not allowed to strike another person, that we've already seen, but that even if the other guy starts it, and even if he's striking you, you have to try and extricate yourself from the altercation without using force, if at all possible. Okay, and that's a halacha. So, first of all, he says, she'ein ba shava pruta. So first, he says that if the amount of the slap or the blow does not involve monetary restitution, so the Imrei Yaakov says in Sifkat and Tes, v'im hikahu makeh she'ein ba shava pruta, v'chazar v'hikahu makeh she'ein ba shava pruta, u'v'tzir shnehem yesh shava pruta, tzarech iyan iloke bazeh. What if a guy slaps me repeatedly, and each slap does not incur any monetary damage, but the aggregate of those slaps makes me develop some kind of bruise? Is a guy liable for malchus? Is he liable for lashes in that situation? Or is he only liable for monetary restitution? He says that's that's a gray area in halacha, but he just wants to mention that's a gray area. Okay, then Yud, hol ve'ein ba chiyuv mama. When there's no monetary restitution due, the aggressor gets malchus. Aval im yesh bo chiyuv mamon, no sein mamon, ve'ein malkin oso. But if there is monetary restitution due because the guy gave me a good bruise or there's broken bones or whatever, so then restitution is due for payment for a number of different types of damages that can be assessed upon an aggressor, and he does not get malchus. Afal gav shehisrubo, even if he was warned in advance, because we have this principle of restitution supplants malchus, and the Shulchan Aruch goes into a whole litany of how you assess the damages, which we're not going to get into now. Yud Aleph, va'afilu im chaveru hischel imo b'meriva v'cherfo. And this halacha that you're not allowed to strike another Jew is true even if the other party started the fight, and even if he calls your mother all kinds of nasty names. And the reason is he says the reason why this halacha is true is because you always have the option of walking away. Always have the option of ignoring the insult and walking away. He says, if however a person loses it, he hears someone insult his wife, his mother, another member of his family, or he gets insulted, and then he loses it and he gives the guy a slap, right? So he's violated the Torah. Is he now called a rasha? Is he now called a wicked person? He says no. He does not attain the status of a wicked person if he was provoked, right? Ella amrina, if you recall, we had said that if a person strikes someone else, he's called a rasha. But if a person was provoked into anger and he lost it, he does not become a rasha by definition. Ella amrinan libo ratach ve'en adam nitfas al tzaro. But we rather say that he lost control of himself. It's literally, the words are libo ratach, his heart boiled over, and a person cannot be taken completely to task when he's in emotional pain. Ve'eno mishalem boshes elenezek tsar ripoy v'sheves, and therefore he doesn't have to pay full damages. He only has to pay partial damages for the damage that he caused. If he caused the guy to require medical attention, he certainly has to pay for that. He certainly has to pay for his pain and suffering. He certainly has to pay for his time off from work if the guy lost work because he was punched in the gut or whatever. But because the other fellow provoked him and started him, there's one assessment of damage that he doesn't have to pay for, which is called boshet. And that's called embarrassment. It's sort of like included in pain and suffering. A person's entitled to be compensated for the pain. The Beis Din can assess how much pain this person had to endure and put a dollar amount on it. But normally you would also assess the aggressor for boshet, which is the humiliation that the person experienced if this was a public altercation. Because he was the provocateur, so then you don't have to pay him for that. That's the one thing he does. He's not entitled to compensation because you provoked me, that's why. V'harishon shechirfehu v'hotzi alav shem ra, nehi shepater mehabosha shahari kibel dino, b'kol makom tzarich lihitvadot v'lomer berabim shesheker diber u'mevakesh mechila. So after the guy who lost it and punched the guy, the other party also has to make restitution. He doesn't have to make monetary restitution, but the Beis Din can obligate him to say that in the event that he insulted him or a member of his family and said something that was not true, or said something that was an exaggeration, he has to publicly ask mechila from the person who was insulted. So it goes both ways. Even if the Beis Din would have so I punch a guy, right? Get into a big fight. I lose control of myself and I give him a punch. I break his nose. He takes me to Beis Din, right? And the Beis Din says, you had no right to punch him in the nose. What right did you have to do that? We're going to have to assess you damages, right? So they will assess the damages, but then the aggressor, right? He says, well, did you hear what he said about my wife? And the Beis Din says, did you say that about his wife? And so then, yes, so the damages have to be paid, but you must also publicly say to this person that you ask for his forgiveness and what you said was not correct. And that's part of the judgment that can take place in Beis Din. So again, this is dealing with human interaction, financial affairs. Here, this is not business. This is personal. But but it does, I mean, unfortunately, these things do happen. They have happened in the past. It's very rare in today's world for it to happen. But, sometimes the sting of a public insult is much worse than getting punched in the nose. Yeah. And by the way, the Gemara does say that if you hashomea cherpato hashomea cherpatam ve'enam mishivim, that anyone who listens to their insult and does not respond, like they occupy the highest station in God's eyes. They're like the sun shining brightly in all of its intensity. That's the language of the Gemara. That it is a very big challenge. It's a very big challenge when someone publicly insults you to know how to control yourself. But the Gemara has only effusive praise for someone who's capable of doing that, and really just holding back. Okay.
All right, can I ask a quick question about that?
Sure.
I appreciate the strength and fortitude needed not to respond publicly, but is there then also a responsibility to approach the person afterwards privately and say that what was said was a problem and seek an apology or because otherwise people will think that they can sort of do that to anyone and there's no consequences, and I'm just wondering whether there's a second piece to that.
I think depending on the circumstances, Paul, there will be a second piece. Sometimes other people will be able to address the issue for you, and sometimes it can't be addressed. Sometimes it can, and sometimes it cannot. Okay? There are people who are just very unhappy people, and they lash out at others over whom they are jealous or resentful, and there's not much that you can do to correct them for the next time. But they end up self-destructing because people tend to move away from those kinds of people. They have a lot of negative energy, right? And so sometimes there's not much that you can do, and sometimes there is something you can do. Let's say someone makes a joke at your expense, and it stings. And you know that this person didn't really mean to hurt your feelings, they just wanted to make a joke. So then it is appropriate to go over it and tell them, you really hurt my feelings, that wasn't very nice, and I expect an apology. But you have to know the situation. You have to know the situation.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay. Next, Chavero hitchil, if your friend starts the fight, even if your friend starts the fight, you don't have a right to strike them. Davka Chavero, aval im ishto mekalalato, b'chinam. Okay, so this is only when it comes to your friend. But let's say your wife starts insulting you or cursing you. O mizalzelet ba'aviv v'imo, or she starts to insult your parents. Okay, v'hochicha bidvarim, and you rebuke her. You say, wife of mine, this is not acceptable. I don't want you speaking ill of my parents. Ve'enam mashgachat alav, and she refuses to listen to you. She's a true shrew, and she keeps on with this kind of insulting language. And okay, anyway. Yesh Omrim, well, this is shocking. He says, Yesh Omrim, he quotes the Ramah in Even HaEzer, which is the Shulchan Aruch, de mutar lahakota, that it would be permitted to strike your wife in this situation, which of course today would be called spousal abuse. You'd end up in jail if you did this. But in the times of the Shulchan Aruch, it was considered to be acceptable to strike your wife if she insults you, curses you, or your family members. V'lav dafka b'mikra zeh, ela kol ma shehi osa keneged dat Torah rashai lahakota. According to this opinion, any kind of scenario where your wife is violating religion, you would be allowed to strike her. Afilu overet b'mitzvah shehi sheva al taisa, even if she passively violates a mitzvah. Like, for example, she bakes challah and she didn't take the hafrashas challah. It's a passive crime. Or let's say, she didn't cook your dinner, which is her obligation. Passive. So according to this opinion, you'd be allowed to strike her. Umikol makom, but nevertheless, al yimaher b'haka'ah, but you shouldn't be quick to strike. Barak im hochicha betochacha gemura kama pa'amim kedeboy v'ro'eh she'ena shomat. And it's only if you rebuked her repeatedly and she still refuses to listen. So then it is permitted, according to this opinion, which he's quoting from. These are all medieval sources. Then you would be allowed to strike your wife. Now, this just will not go. This will not fly in today's society, but it's at least interesting to see that there was halachic basis. I mean, if a man was brought to Beis Din and his wife has a bruise, and she says, "My husband is abusing me," and the Beis Din would ask him, "How can you do this to your wife?" And he says, "Well, she called my parents pigs, or she burnt my dinner." Or she's not observing the halacha. She was walking outside the house without her hair covered, or any other kind of reason that a person could come up with. It's conceivable that in a previous era, the Beis Din might side with the husband, which is just, that would never fly in today's world. Never. It would never fly. Any kind of spousal abuse is not tolerated. And this is one issue. This is one area where the halacha has evolved based on societal norms. That's all we can say. But, if you see there are certain cultures that still exist within Orthodox Judaism today, perhaps not in Canada, but perhaps in other countries, where perhaps people are more hot-tempered, where you can certainly understand that there is, going back centuries, there might be vestiges of this kind of practice, and at least understand it, if we can't condone it, but at least understand it. Okay.
Rabbi, it's interesting to me that Judaism, which sets sort of one of the highest standards for personal behavior, that society in this particular case would have evolved ahead of halacha in sort of refining one's self about the relations when they're upset with somebody. That today with all our standards that have fallen by the wayside in society, that this is an area that's evolved better in society than halacha. It's a little bit puzzling.
Okay, so this is one of what we call, this is a meta question. This is a very, very large question that you're asking, Ron, and it has to do with sort of, what do we do with halachic norms which are deemed now to be archaic and anachronistic. Okay, and that's a very large question. It's a huge question, and it's something that I may have alluded to or discussed in the past. And I use the word evolved deliberately because there is a question that is sometimes presented almost like a refutation of the authenticity of the divine origin of the Torah. One of the arguments goes like this: the Torah says you're allowed to own slaves. How can that be God-given if we know how horrible slavery is? So the Torah permits slavery. So doesn't that show that it's a man-made document, right? That's how the argument goes. And the response to that argument is that the Torah is speaking to a generation where slavery was the economic norm within society, and that it was as beneficial for the slave as it was for the master, for slavery to continue as part of an economic chain or system that existed in the ancient world, because there were people who were completely destitute and had no means of providing for themselves, and slavery was a way of a person surviving where they would otherwise die in the street. They would indenture themselves to a master who would give them clothing, a roof over their heads, and in exchange for that, the person indentures themselves to their master and works for them for the rest of their lives. And that was considered an acceptable norm because there was a kind of quid pro quo exchange for services in exchange for life, because life was so miserable at one point in the evolution of society. And we have trouble relating to this because everyone's got a safety net in the Western world today, right? Everyone's got a safety net. The safety net is welfare or other protective services and social services, that no one should have to ever feel that there's nothing, I'm going to die in the street if I don't sell myself into slavery. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to appreciate. So when the Torah addresses slavery, it says slavery is a norm within the economy that we currently live in. So, but the slavery therefore cannot be banned because the Jewish people are one nation within a larger civilization that is worldwide. And if the Torah were to ban slavery, it would no longer be economically viable for a Jewish economy to thrive, because that was considered the economic norm. So with that understanding, the Torah prescribes regulation on slavery. Here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. If you strike your slave and he sustains an injury, you must set them free. That was an innovation of the Bible in a world where people were abusing their slaves regularly. If you acquire a Jewish slave, he can only work for you for 7 years, and on the 7th year, you must free him. Innovation. That's completely unheard of. And then if you go into the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Talmudic addendum to that, anyone who acquires a slave really acquires a master, because if you only have one pillow, and it's either you get the pillow or your slave gets the pillow, you have to give it to your slave, because your slave can never live on a living standard that is less than the master. So the Torah regulates an economic reality or a social reality that is part of the time in which you live. I want to continue this conversation, but we got to go to Minyan. So we'll continue this in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay?
Fascinating. Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Happy